This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Tonight we're turning our focus to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders during AAPI Heritage Month. You'll see how one group is responding to attacks on AAPI communities in a unique way, but that ain't all. You'll also see how AAPI folks have contributed to a rich history of hip-hop and American arts and culture. But first, let's get into what you need to know right now. Perhaps the biggest step toward normalcy today as the Centers for Disease Control updates its mask guidance again. If you're fully vaccinated, no need to wear one indoors or crowded settings outdoors. The CDC says masks should still be worn in crowded indoor settings, but this announcement could ease restrictions for reopening offices and schools. The news comes as the race to get kids vaccinated kicks into full throttle. Today, at least 20,000 pharmacies stood ready to administer the Pfizer vaccine to children at least 12 years old. Many other pharmacies already started giving shots to kids on Wednesday. To make the process as simple as possible for families, many states plan to set up vaccination centers at schools, camps, parks, and even beaches. Health officials say efforts to vaccinate this age group might present even more challenges than with adults. For one, a recent survey revealed some parents were hesitant to vaccinate their kids even if they already got the shot themselves. Children also need some kind of parental consent, which varies by state. In some cases, parents have to be physically present. But there's no shortage of incentives to encourage vaccinations. Ohio might have the best I've come across. This week, the governor announced a vaccine lottery of sorts for anyone who's gotten at least one dose. Teens in the state have a chance to win a full 4-year scholarship to a public university in Ohio, room and board included. Anyone 18 and older has a chance to win $1 million. They're doing a total of 5 drawings for each.
Now, I know that some of you now are shaking your head and say, that Mike DeWine, he's crazy. This $1 million drawing idea of yours is a waste of money. The real waste is a life that is lost now to COVID-19.
Gas is back to flowing through the Colonial Pipeline along the East Coast, but shortages might linger for a few days. The pipeline itself stretches for 5,500 miles, and gas flows through it at a rate of about 5 miles per hour. I'm no mathematician, but basically it's going to take a bit to fully refill those areas that were almost guzzled dry. Experts say the supply shortage was mainly triggered because of panic buying. Nervous motorists really got to hoarding. In North Carolina, more than 70% of stations are completely dry, and things aren't looking much better in neighboring states. The lingering truck driver shortage also worsened the problem. The other concern that this whole situation heightened was the nation's outdated cybersecurity for infrastructure.
Honestly, the fact that people are saying now, oh, we got to take notice of ransomware. I'm sorry, it's like a bomb went off 10 years ago and now people are noticing it, you know?
On Wednesday, the president signed an executive order aimed at strengthening cybersecurity. It requires federal agencies to introduce multi-factor authentication to their systems and encrypt all data within 6 months to try and make it harder for hackers to get through.
This event is providing an urgent reminder of why we need to harden our infrastructure and make it more resilient against all threats, natural and man-made.
During that press conference today, President Biden said the hackers didn't appear to be working for the Russian government, but they did live in Russia. According to a report from Bloomberg, Colonial Pipeline paid nearly $5 million in cryptocurrency to hackers for the ransomware attack. The Asian American and Pacific Islander population is the fastest growing racial group in the country. By 2065, they're projected to make up 14% of the whole US population. And in the political world, politicians are starting to realize that Asian American and Pacific Islanders' votes hold some serious power. In the most recent presidential election, AAPI voter turnout soared by more than 45% compared to the 2016 election. Next week, this organization will host its first ever Asian Pacific American Heritage Month Unity Summit, named From Violence to Victory. That name is an acknowledgement of the recent attacks on AAPI communities. And with those attacks top of mind, this AAPI group is pointing out a lack of data about the AAPI community in the US, something that makes them an understudied racial group. Over the last year, we've been inundated with stories and images of those attacks on the AAPI community. In response, some groups supporting that community have decided to show force, while others have decided to run. To be clear, they're not running from anything, but they're running for AAPI communities impacted by both attacks and hardships brought on by the pandemic. We traveled to New York City to meet up with a runner who's building a global network to help protect and preserve Chinatown stateside and abroad. Here's our reporting for In the Loop, in the field.
So much about the running community is about supporting each other. There's a certain amount of humanity when you are running next to somebody. It's like what many of us call like a shared language that's unspoken. One of the most human moments that you can experience is like suffering with another person.
Running can be painful, but for some, it's also a necessary form of activism. You see, communities like the Chinatown neighborhood here in Flushing, New York, are often a social hub, economic lifeblood, and a cultural refuge for immigrants across generations. And when the pandemic hit, Chinatowns were some of the first neighborhoods to feel it. A survey of still standing storefronts in Manhattan's Chinatown reported most of them lost business before the governor's March 22nd shutdown. And then came the attacks. Nationwide, more than 3,700 attacks on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were reported between March of last year and February of this year. And one group says reported attacks in the first quarter of this year have risen 164% compared to the same time last year. After a year of economic hardship and hate crimes against AAPI communities, a US-based network called Chinatown Runners wants to help build stronger, safer Chinatowns. They're aiming to bring more attention and more dollars into these neighborhoods and to build support both online and on the ground.
Feeling like this could end poorly, but it seems like it'll be a casual enough run so that even if I'm slacking, folks might give me a little bit of grace, which I'm looking for.
I founded Chinatown Runners not as a crew, but as a decentralized worldwide movement. Hopefully today and all of the events related to Chinatown Runners will continue to be a safe space for all of us to uplift and celebrate each other for our differences and our similarities, not in spite of them.
Runners in cities across the world have adopted the Chinatown Runners hashtag. And it's not just US cities like Boston or Philly, it's also international cities like Madrid, Spain, or Hamilton, Ontario. Anywhere people want to run in solidarity and support AAPI communities.
I'm not necessarily a social or political activist, I don't think, but I'm a runner and I have this ability to network with a lot of other runners and other running communities.
What is the value that you're hoping to bring to those communities that have been, impacted by the pandemic and impacted by a spate of attacks that have been going on for at least the last year?
I think the most direct line I could draw immediately is obviously bringing people physically to those neighborhoods, which hopefully will also help make the neighborhood feel alive again. I think that starts to build those bridges that are so necessary for us to want to care about each other, to want to protect these communities and see each other as valuable. Having spaces where we can really celebrate each other's differences is kind of what it's all about.
What's also great about that piece is the amount of editing done to make me look like a strong runner, because your boy was struggling. Personally, I don't think we talk about music enough on the show, which is why I'm pumped to share this next story. Talent from Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is all over the music industry, and the connection between hip hop and Asian communities runs deep. Newsy's Casey Mendoza spoke to rappers who brought their community together to highlight Asian American history in their work.
Killed us in the camps and in the Chinatowns. This violence isn't random, it's just another round.
What you're hearing there is Making the Band from hip-hop artists Jason Chu, Alan Z, and Humble the Poet. It's part of a new album, Face Value, that tackles Asian American history and spotlights the Asian hip-hop community.
Listening to this album is kind of like the reminder that we're all in this together and we're coming together as a unified front.
Hip-hop has always been a genre about empowerment and liberation for marginalized people, and it's long inspired countless Asian American artists.
Groups like Public Enemy, NWA, all these people that were defining and that had something to say about the society around us.
I felt understood because a lot of these stories are people that are disenfranchised, people that are, you know, underdogs, outcasts.
It hit an emotion that, like, I think I was an angry kid. You know, I was confused. I was angry at the world.
I think that is something that really identified with all of us immigrants, of course, right?
We got a new thing out, gonna make you shout. Got rhythm, got beat, gonna move your feet. Got class, finesse, a whole lot of style. Gonna be around for a long, long while.
In 1979, Afro-Filipino disco artist Joe Bataan debuted Rapo Clapo, now considered to be one of the earliest rap songs ever recorded, and built off the cultural influences of New York's hip-hop community and pioneers like DJ Kool Herc, Africa Bambaataa, and Grandmaster Flash. From the 70s and 80s onward, hip-hop grew with the success of artists like NWA, Run DMC, and Public Enemy, inspiring a major wave of Asian American rappers, breakdancers, and producers entering the scene in the 90s, and artists like the Mountain Brothers, Rhythm X, and the rap duo of Key Cool and DJ Redmatic contributed to the growing hip-hop culture.
So many people listen to rap nowadays, but so many people don't even know what the rappers are saying.
You know, a lot of people go, yo, why is there such a deep tie between Asian American communities and this, you know, black and brown art form? And I think because so much of Asian American culture, as we've been wrestling with identity for about 50 years, parallels the birth of hip hop culture as it grew and it had its growing pains.
Rapper Jason Chu, an expert on the intersection of Asian American identity and hip-hop culture, says that the two communities developed at the same time, building from the shared histories of racism and identity in the U.S.
I think that there's been such a parallel to where now you have a ton of young, you know, 15 to 25-year-old Asian Americans who literally grew up with hip hop as the dominant voice of not just marginalized cultures, but of pop culture in their lifetime.
You got groups like the 88 Rising here, Far East Movement, Drunken Tiger from Korea, who I grew up listening to. Like, that was the first Korean that I related to, because it was a player in the hip hop industry that looked like me.
Today, the representation of Asian American artists is still growing in hip-hop, with labels like Ruckus Avenue pioneering South Asian hip-hop both in the US and internationally.
You gotta adapt.
We really had a lot to do with how young South Asians in this country also viewed themselves as potentially being artists. Not only was hip-hop conducive for us, but I think that story itself was very unique to us, and I think that we needed the hip-hop forum for it.
Casey Mendoza, Newsy, Chicago.
Here to talk to us a bit about that story you just saw is Casey Mendoza. I'd like to know if you are okay with playing a game with us. Something we haven't done in a while. It's called Explain This. For the folks at home who don't know what Explain This is, we'll show our friend Casey here an image or a video, and it's up to her to explain what it is. Explain this. Let's dive right into it. Casey, can you explain this?
So this is Margaret Cho's 90s sitcom All-American Girl. It was the very first TV show to have a majority Asian cast, and it came out during the 90s. So during this like major wave of Asian American representation on screen, and of course, as I mentioned in my story, in hip hop. It was a really groundbreaking time period for Asian American artists. You know, that TV show only lasted for about a season, but it also came around the same time the Joy Luck Club movie came out. It came out during the time of also like a lot of B-boys and B-girls starting to like get more active on college campuses or on the West Coast. So it was really this like big rise and push for talent and a recognition of talent. That is, you know, I think it's continuing today too.
You are just a wealth of pop culture knowledge. Let's go to the second image. Casey, can you explain this?
Yes, this is Kim Namjoon, better known as RM from the South Korean boy band BTS. He is my personal BTS bias, which means he is my favorite. But beyond that, he is really like this talent in South Korean music right now that's really pushing for rap and hip hop. You know, he's done a lot of interviews where he's talked about how his work is very influenced by Eminem. He's done collaborations with Drunken Tiger, who is known as like the godfather of Korean hip hop. So to me, he's also like this evidence of the growing popularity of rap and hip hop, outside of the US and specifically in Asia.
We're spending all this time talking about music. You should have put together like a Spotify playlist for our viewers.
I actually did.
Oh, so you did?
We made like this fun little playlist of all of the songs and artists I mentioned in my story, but also some, like other artists that are big in the game now or have been. The community is so large and so vast. The playlist is called In Case You Were Looking for an AAPI Hip Hop Playlist. Which, I found some, but then I wanted to make my own.
Casey, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We appreciate you, your time, and your playlist. Earlier in the show, we talked a bit about anti-Asian violence. What we're learning is that even if you're not the direct victim, those attacks could still be detrimental to your mental health. Newsy's Kat Sandoval tells us how anti-Asian hate is causing a mental health crisis in the AAPI community and how to address that.
The toll of anti-Asian incidents during this pandemic goes beyond physical attacks. For many Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, or AAPIs, it could also lead to sleep troubles, depression, and PTSD. That's because psychologists we spoke to say anti-Asian hate impacts not only the victims, it can also have mental health impacts on those indirectly exposed through watching viral videos or doom scrolling online.
Racialized distress or trauma can lead to very detrimental health complications. So in addition to disturbed sleep and eating, you can also develop bad habits that lead to things like hypertension and diabetes.
And one factor that makes the mental health impacts even more notable, several studies of different API groups suggest lower rates of seeking mental health treatment than any other races.
It's largely because they've been taught to keep their heads down and to work hard and try and work out their differences among themselves. It's different than with other groups because there's implications for your entire clan, not just the person. When you out yourself as having an issue, this could have implications for the rest of your family.
But why do we feel a psychological impact in the first place? Let's break down two different types of trauma here. After the Atlanta shooting that left 8 people dead, 6 of whom were Asian women, many were fearful.
The reality is that this could have been me or my sister or my family.
Psychologist Kevin Nadal says deeply relating to victims or to the survivors is part of a collective trauma.
Collective trauma is the notion that people of any given group may have a response to a traumatic event. This is a collective sense of pain, hurt, suffering. Asian American women may be experiencing even more of a specific type of collective trauma because of their sense of connection to the people who were killed.
As a Korean American, what breaks my heart the most is that I think about my grandmother and just can't imagine her being in that situation.
There's also historical trauma, a theory that a population's agonizing experience of physical or psychological stress can be passed to future generations.
Jewish people will experience the historical trauma of the Holocaust. Black people experience the historical trauma of slavery.
The Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment camps in World War II that basically swept up over 100,000 Japanese Americans simply because of their heritage.
So let's talk about solutions. What can members of communities facing hate do to deal with the psychological impacts? Our experts say talk to someone, a friend, family, or a professional about your feelings or any physical pain. Do things that make you feel safe, like walking in pairs. And lastly, solutions shouldn't rely on the shoulders of APIs alone.
I think it's important to acknowledge the systemic role of racism in our society because we can't just rely on the survivors of violence or the survivors of discrimination to develop strategies.
Nadal says acknowledging that anti-Asian racism exists is the first step. Then education, like teaching API history in classrooms to combat bias. For Newsy, I'm Kat Sandoval.
If you haven't done so already, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter using the hashtag #NewsyInTheLoop. If you have done so already, you're not exempt. Never stop tweeting us. All right, we're going to take a quick trip back to a state I called home for years, Illinois. Lawmakers there are considering a bill that would make sure every student in the state learns the history of Asian Americans in the U.S. If the bill is signed into law, which it is expected to be, Illinois would be the first state to mandate a unit of Asian American history in its public schools. Newsy's Alex Livingston has more.
We're making sure that our Asian American students know their history, but also that all students know Asian American history.
Illinois State Senator Ram Vilivalam is one of the leading lawmakers behind the Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History Act, otherwise known as TEACH Act. He and State Representative Jennifer Gong Gershowitz reintroduced the bill in January of this year. And after passing the Illinois House by an overwhelming majority of 98-13, it's now being considered in the Senate.
It would really ensure that we elevate crucial stories like the wrongful incarceration of Japanese Americans in the 1940s.
Now, along with guaranteeing every Illinois public school student learns about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, all as part of their U.S. history courses, the bill would add Asian American history curriculum to the Illinois school code.
It all starts with our youth better understanding who they are and better understanding who others are.
You don't really learn about Asian American history when you're, taking your U.S. history class in high school. A lot of people don't learn Asian American history until they go to college. So we wanted to create that opportunity both for Asian American students in the state to see themselves reflected in what they're learning, but also for students of all backgrounds to develop more empathy, to learn, the rich history and contributions of Asian Americans in the United States.
The nonprofit organization Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago drafted the bill language for TEACH. Director of Organizing Grace Pye hopes passage of the bill will allow schools to teach all aspects of Asian American history.
Asian American history is incredibly diverse. Our community is incredibly diverse. We come from dozens of countries, we speak dozens of different languages. And so I think it's really important for the implementation of this new requirement to really recognize and highlight the diversity of our community.
And advocates hope that education will lead to better understanding of Asian American history and culture, and as a result, fewer acts of racism against Asian Americans.
We've seen such a huge rise in anti-Asian racism and sentiment and violence over the last year. It's been, I think, really striking and disturbing. And so we wanted to be able to tackle that problem with kind of a more long-term perspective, to think about how can we interrupt, these cycles that lead people to, commit these acts of violence or lead people to believe stereotypes or, other harmful narratives about Asian Americans. We felt that education was a good place to start.
I do have to say that I hope that it will have the intended consequence of reducing the discrimination and hate crimes that have been happening for a long time towards our community, but especially over the last year.
That's it for us, gang. As always, thanks for watching. We love putting this kind of content in front of y'all. Now it's time for me to clean my dishes, cut off the lights, and vacate the premises. We'll be back for more in the loop next week, same time, same place. Top stories or something from Newsy is headed your way right now.